This video is sponsored by Wren.
Okay, let's talk about lady spaces. If you're new here, hi, I'm Mika, and this is Boba. Hey Bobs! And we make videos about politics, philosophy, and neurodivergency, so do subscribe and hit the bell if you're into that kind of thing. If you don't like this video, Boba will destroy my office. My last video was about gender-critical ideology and why it's antithetical to feminism. You don't need to watch that one for this one to make sense, but you still should because it's good. In fact, I think you should watch all of my videos because views mean food in the content creation world. I'm going to be talking about gender criticals again today because these are people who keep claiming to be speaking on my behalf, and frankly, I've had enough. This video is specifically about female-only spaces and what gender criticals, aka trans-exclusionary radical feminists, aka anti-gender, aka sex realists have to say about them. Female-only spaces is a bit of a vague term, isn't it? So let's have a look at which kinds of spaces these people won't shut up about. Female-only spaces is a really popular talking point among gender criticals. Women deserve safe spaces. This is probably one of their most understandable lines, and that's probably why they repeat it ad nauseum. It's a quite vague, albeit seemingly innocent statement though, isn't it? The kinds of spaces gender criticals mean when they talk about safe spaces for women include toilets, changing rooms, schools, prisons, hospital wards, sporting teams, residential facilities and abuse crisis centres and shelters. Anywhere where we might traditionally see segregation of the sexes. Because this is already another long video, I won't be talking about schools or much about sports today. I won't be talking about segregated schooling at all, to be honest, because as far as I'm concerned, it's Victorian nonsense. Education should not be segregated, and so personally, I don't take seriously any attempt to protect or prolong that practice. I simply reject the premise, and so will not be wasting my breath on it. Some might say that certain religious environments might necessitate this kind of segregation, but to that I would say that if the problem at hand is people experimenting with gender and gender fluidity undermining segregation of the sexes, then that kind of fundamentalist environment is hardly going to be the kind of place that would nurture any kind of experimentation of gender at all. So the point, dear viewer, is moot. And I won't be discussing sport at length because honestly, I fucking hate sport. I don't know anything about sport. I hate watching it, I hate reading it, I hate the reverence that we give to sporting stars. I resent. But I did do a little bit of research about sex segregation within sport and what GCs have to say about it, and I do have a couple of things to say. First, I'd like to point to this thread about the history of women's sport. Gender critical people make out like women's sport as a category exists so that women can succeed at sport. The argument goes that because men are just naturally bigger, harder, better, faster, stronger, women would just never be able to win unless they had their own categories. But the actual history of women's sport paints a very different picture indeed. Rather than a history of inclusion of women within sport, it's a history of exclusion and protecting male supremacy. Women started competing and winning, or at least doing really well against men. And this would not do, so women were banned. And then later on, after a lot of pressure, women were finally allowed to compete again, so long as they had female-only teams. From football to skating to basketball, we see this pattern unfold. Not only that, but in recent years, we've started to see women outperform men again in a variety of sports, including shooting, surfing, and endurance racing. The disparity between male and female performance levels can be, in large part, not entirely, but in large part explained by the fact that the pool from which we can draw elite female athletes is by orders of magnitude smaller than the male pool. Look at male athletes back in the day. Top sporting stars in the 1800s were slower, less agile, and would never have a hope in hell at winning against a modern athlete. It's not because men in the 1800s were just biologically inferior to men now, but that over time, with more and more men competing to beat the last guy, we see a great improvement. This will be the same with women too. Women have just had less time. But it doesn't explain all the disparities. Calm down, keyboard warriors. There are physical differences between men and women.
All we're saying is that men and women are different.
Sorry, I don't know where that came from. It's been a very long day. There are. Men and women are different, and some of these physical differences can explain why, on average, men are better at certain events, whereas on average, women are better at others. There's a whole bunch of science and biology that I'd have to get in to explain the ins and outs of all this, the nuances therein, and how this fact is being abused, and that would be a whole video all by itself about sport, and I shan't. It's also worth noting that attempts to level the playing field of women's sport has historically targeted cis women, particularly cis black women, on the grounds of biological advantages. Of course, biological advantages when applied to men's sport is usually just called a good athlete. I'm shutting up about cursed sport now. But if you are interested in learning more about the things that I just completely glossed over, there are resources below in the sources doc. So for this video, I'm going to group together toilets and changing rooms and hospital wards and residential facilities because they're somewhat similar in nature and the stuff I have to say about them is too. So today's video is going to be broken up like this, and you will find timestamps linked in the description. So are we sitting comfortably? Good. Then we'll begin. First and foremost, we've something to get out the way. So this whole spaces debate, it's to do with trans people and their rights to use spaces which align with their gender. That's a right they currently hold. And that is what this discussion is about. But if you ask gender criticals, many of them will say that this discussion isn't about real trans people at all. You see, they say the problem is with cis men pretending to be trans to gain access to female-only spaces. That used to be what most of them would say, but your modern gender critical is way more mask off. It's known, and I will be referring to it here as the fake trans argument. And I want to get it out the way first because When I talk about all these different types of spaces and what gender criticals say about them, I want you to keep in mind that the issue at hand is trans people's rights. Because you see, when we're talking about gender and spaces, gender criticals don't want you picturing a young trans woman being forced to use the men's bathrooms. They want you to picture a cis male predator, a big burly man peering over the cubicle doors in the women's loos. They want you to imagine it's your daughter in there, powerless and vulnerable. This bathroom debate has all the hallmarks of a moral panic, and like with all good moral panics, those most morally panicked can't seem to see the wood for the trees. So let's talk about big, burly men. This photo was recently shared online by a gender-critical person who claims that to allow people to decide what gender they are risks allowing cis men into women's spaces to take advantage. She says,
under #self-ID and the Gender Recognition Act, no one can challenge this guy for being in the women's restroom, as all he has to do is say he's a woman and suddenly it's okay. Women being made to feel threatened or uncomfortable doesn't factor. This man could have walked into the women's bathroom by mistake, but when he saw all the women in there, he needed to turn around and walk back out. Instead, he stayed. He just didn't care that he was making women feel uncomfortable and threatened.
So, a few things. People can and do challenge people in bathrooms. Nowhere in law does it say, don't challenge anyone in a bathroom, or you'll go to jail. Trans people get challenged in bathrooms all the time. I've heard from cis men who've been challenged in bathrooms for having long hair. And cis butch women get challenged in bathrooms so often, they've named the phenomenon the bathroom problem. So she then invents a motivation, makes up a guy, so to speak. If they had confronted him, he might have said he's a woman, and then they'd be at his mercy as he washed his hands. Or, as she alludes to here, he knew what he was doing and he did not care. Being in there was a power move, and so any confrontation would have resulted in scary things, she says.
He stayed. He just didn't care that he was making women feel uncomfortable and threatened. There was a mother and her 2 kids in there also. She was waiting outside one's door asking if he needed help, talking about poop, etc., as mothers often do with their kids. This man was in the next cubicle. In there for a while, too. I nor any other female felt we could approach him. This makes me so uncomfortable. Having seen the disgusting, voyeuristic content some men post on the internet from women-only spaces, especially women-only public toilets. Having gained entry through sheer brazenness, like this man, or by claiming to identify as a woman.
Or have you? Have you seen the disgusting and voyeuristic content about men in women's bathrooms that people post on the internet? Is that because you're posting it? This woman took photos of strangers in a public bathroom, posted them on the internet, didn't blur their faces out either, by the way, I did that. And then she not only talked about them being in the cubicle for a while, and she must have been in there for quite a while herself, but then she implies that this being in the cubicle for a while might have had something to do with the child in the other stall. This is a pretty gross and completely unevidenced accusation to make of strangers while you're secretly photographing them in the toilet. Okay, so first, it's not illegal to go into the wrong toilet, and it never has been. Can you imagine if toilet cleaners were criminals for half their shifts? But aside from that, there's any number of reasons why a man might be in the women's toilets. A mistake, poor vision, fatigue, just being in your own world, maybe to assist a female companion, maybe just getting cut short. There are many conditions that lots of people have where when you've got to go, you've got to go. And men's toilets very often only have a couple of cubicles. Honestly, the reason why I would be uncomfortable confronting a man in the women's toilets is those reasons. He could be in there for an embarrassing reason, and I'm not going to go poking my nose into it and making him say it out loud. But this thread is hypocritical in a number of other ways too. As Lyrical Muse pointed out on Twitter, it kind of completely undermines the fake trans argument. I'll link the full thread below, but to summarise, because it really is excellent.
It disproves the gender-critical assertion that to make it easier for trans people to gain recognition of their gender is to make it easier for men to access female-only spaces. Men can already gain access to female spaces and, as I said, there is any number of valid reasons that could excuse their being there without pretending to be a woman. Lyrical Muse then points out that this reveals a crucial truth. Gender-critical women would and happily do confront trans women and butch cis women in the toilets. But here we see that a manly man will go unchallenged.
So if you're a man trying to get into women's spaces for nefarious plots, then dressing like a woman would invite challenge, not deter it. Dressing like or pretending to identify as a woman offers no advantage. And this, Lyrical Muse goes on to say, reveals yet another crucial truth. That gender-critical women know full well that there is a huge difference between a trans woman and a man, and that they do not really consider trans women to be dangerous. They will happily accost them. The fake trans argument, I think, is ludicrous, but it does seem to get a lot of traction. The fact that you even know what I mean by the bathroom debate is testament to that. So let's debunk it some more. We've seen that men can gain access to women's spaces if they really insist, but the fact remains that crimes are crimes. A crime done by anyone is illegal. And somebody acting inappropriately in a space can be removed, no matter what their gender is. The idea that we'd have to just sit back and let anything go is the most slipperiest of slippery slope arguments, and therefore I think deserves no respect whatsoever. But then the GCs might say, wait,
But a penis in the vagina room is inappropriate, and we wouldn't be able to do anything if you had your way.
But this is where we get into, like, literal crotch inspector territory. Some GCs will say that as long as trans people have fully transitioned, then they can come in. By which they mean that they've had a very specific kind of surgery. But as Katie Montgomery points out, video linked below, they don't mean it. Their goalposts are as slippery as their slopes. But even if they did mean it, what proof of crotch are we going to have to provide on entry to the toilets?
Oh well, people can get a certificate from their doctor.
So yeah, and who's going to check it? And why should somebody who is feminine in every single way be forced into a room full of men where she'll stick out like a sore thumb? The same obviously applies to trans men being forced into female spaces. So then they might say, oh well,
You'll only have to produce a certificate if you don't look quite right to us.
and then of course we get to a place where cis butch women can't use the toilets, where a broad frame and a strong jawline makes you fair game to be accosted on the way to piss. It's ludicrous. It's absurd. And also, it offers cis men yet another way into our spaces, right? If some GCs got their way, then men who want to get into our spaces for creepy activities could just say that they're trans men who haven't had the surgery yet or don't have their certificate yet, and so therefore they have to use the women's toilets. All right, I'm veering quickly towards glibness now, but to me this is absolutely bad stuff. I'm kind of a freedom to swing your fist until it hits me in the face kind of girl when it comes to personal liberties. And so the reason why I wouldn't confront a man in the toilets is because it's none of my business until he makes it my business. And another thing, if gender criticals are so concerned with making sure everybody is properly assigned, then you'd think that they'd be trying to make it easier for trans people to have their gender recognised, rather than what they're actually doing, which is the complete opposite, trying to make it harder and harder. Or that they would be pushing to make non-binary genders recognised under law, rather than the truth, which is that they are very resistant to anything that tries to be inclusive of non-binary people, even to the point of growing apoplectic over the use of the word people.
Oh, but if we make it easier for trans people to have their gender legally recognised, then cis male predators will just legally transition.
No, they won't. What possible advantage would that offer them? Legally actually transitioning? Have you lost your minds? You can't, on one hand, keep pushing statistics in our face about how often men abuse women, and then on the other hand, think that they need to go to such lengths to get to abuse women. Okay, calm down. I need to calm down. GCs are aware that their political desires will endanger trans people. They know that trans people and even people who veer slightly away from gender norms get abused and assaulted in gendered public spaces. That they are far more likely, in fact, to experience this. They know that. In my video on feminism and gender criticalism, I pointed out that anti-gender groups are seen by the EU as of a radical, far-right and fundamentalist religious nature. Several gender-critical groups have been described as hate groups. The assertion that the goal of the gender-critical movement is to limit gender non-conformativity through biological essentialist reasoning and the removal of currently held rights is not an exaggeration. Trans people have been able to use spaces which align with their genders for a really long time, guys. That is their right by law, which gender criticals are trying to undermine. As well as the removal of these currently held rights, gender critical groups want to make it more and more difficult for trans people to gain recognition of their gender, either through policy on healthcare or bureaucracy. If you want to learn about all the ways that trans rights are currently under attack, there are resources below covering all the details by trans groups and individuals. But the most underhanded part of the fake trans argument to me is that fundamentally it's about the behaviour of cis men. And you've heard of collective punishment, right? Collective punishment is the act of punishing a group as a whole for the actions of a few members of that group. It is commonly thought of as being, at best, inherently unfair and unjust, and at worst, a breach of the Geneva Convention due to its tendency to lead to atrocities. But what we see with the fake trans argument is the collective punishment of trans people for the largely hypothetical behaviour of people from outside that group, mainly cis, straight, predatory men. And, as should be obvious, Cis, straight, predatory men will not be put off by the collective punishment of trans people. As part of the moral panic, we also see a pushback against gender-neutral spaces in general. The British Conservative government very recently stated that new buildings in the UK must not have gender-neutral toilets and changing rooms, despite the fact that there have been gender-neutral spaces like that for forever. Now, I'm not here, actually, to argue that all spaces need to be gender-neutral. But before I talk about the reality of spaces today, let's have a little think about the history of sex segregation. Because GCs love to argue that female-only spaces only exist for the protection of women.
We fought for these spaces for our protection.
And in most cases, with a few notable exceptions, that couldn't be further from the truth. Those few notable exceptions being things like IPV and SA and R Centre. Because YouTube, I'm going to have to try and get through this video without saying certain words, which is going to be hard. So here's a key. I'm going to say SA for that. I'm going to say IPV for this. And I'm going to say R for that. I hope that doesn't make it too confusing. I'm doing my best to talk about an extremely sensitive subject without getting demonetized. So with a few notable exceptions like IPV and R crisis centres, most examples of segregation of sexes were rationalised based on different social roles of men and women. It was thought that men and women naturally operated in separate spheres, as well as good old-fashioned oppression, misogyny, and morality. Morality that states that the intermingling of the sexes is dirty and impure. You know the kind. The stiffly straight-laced Christian morality of the Victorian era brought about a rapid decline in women's rights, as well as some of the first ever women's prisons, for example. The need for which was originally justified on the fact that most incarcerated women were in prison for doing sex work, and it was thought by Victorian men at the time that they would be simply making too much money in prison and were therefore not being adequately punished, as well as, and this is true, potentially tainting the morality of other prisoners and the guards. Because it was thought that the female nature was to be pleasant, kind, and subservient. Watch my GC and feminism video for a big explanation of biological essentialism such as this. Incarcerated women were thought of as doubly devious, and therefore much worse, morally speaking, than male prisoners. Now, prisons were obviously very dangerous places to be in back then, and I'm not saying that women's safety wasn't mentioned at all by the people planning those first women's prisons in London. It certainly was, but it was more of a byproduct than a goal. I'll be talking more about prisons later. Right now, it's time for
more toilet thoughts. More toilets. What are these people talking about?
So there's this thing called the bathroom debate, which people who pretend to be serious adults keep insisting on having, for reasons that will become clear soon. One reason it's not for, though, is women's safety. When it comes to toilets and changing rooms, GCs love to share around this piece by the Times newspaper. That's the just as right-wing but slightly more upper-brow version of The Sun. It states that 90% of SAs that happen in changing rooms happen in mixed gender changing rooms. And we should take this seriously because 90 is a very big and scary number. Do you know what's not a big and scary number though? 0.07. I just realised that that's 007 So if you're a villainous genius hell-bent on world domination, then maybe that is quite a scary number to you. So sorry to you. But what's that, 0.07? Well, unlike the Times, I'm not just throwing random numbers at you. So this 90% figure comes from an investigation that the Times conducted, which was essentially a Freedom of Information request into the statistics regarding SA in changing rooms. What they found was that over the course of a year, 2017 to 18 in this case, there were 134 complaints of SA occurring in changing rooms, and out of them, only 14 were in gendered spaces, hence the 90%. But what was also revealed was that there were a further 46 complaints of SA in other areas of leisure centres, such as in the pool, in corridors, or in sports halls. So out of the 180 complaints of SA in leisure centres and public pools, a quarter of them, over 25% of them, occurred in random areas of the building. 8% were in single-sex changing rooms. So when we look at SA in pools and leisure centres, it's closer to 67% of them occurring in gender-neutral changing rooms. But that still seems high though. I mean, it's not a big and scarier number as 90, but it's still pretty big. And considering that toilets and changing rooms are a talking point of choice for gender criticals, probably because everybody uses them, if there was a big problem of SA in these spaces, we absolutely should take that seriously. So I had a look at the ONS page on SA to see how big a problem it is. What is the likelihood of me, for example, experiencing SA in a gender-neutral changing room? According to the ONS, in that same year, there were 151,000 reports of SA in the UK. And if 120 of them occurred in gender-neutral changing rooms, then that would mean that 0.07% of SAs in that year occurred in gender-neutral changing rooms. And in fact, bathrooms, changing rooms, any of the spaces on this list actually do not appear in the ONS statistics as likely venues for SA or R. You are far more likely to fall victim to SA out in public, on the street, or of course, most likely at your or someone else's home than you are ever in the spaces I am talking about here. But things get murkier still because the Times doesn't really go into much details about the statistics, which is unhelpful for a number of reasons. Firstly, they don't break down the genders of the victims or the perpetrators, but secondly, and more importantly, there's no information as to how many of these SAs were done by strangers. Because that's the issue at hand, isn't it? That's the whole GC argument. They're not anti-gender neutral spaces in case someone you spend a lot of time with anyway uses them to assault you. And yet, for women and girls, SA at the hand of a stranger represents only 15%. For men and boys, this figure jumps to almost half, and that's the same as well for trans people. With the vast amount of SA against women and girls, the perpetrator is somebody they know, a colleague, a relative, a friend, a partner, somebody that they spend a lot of time with and who would have access to them no matter where they are. So when we add all that together, the number of women and girls being assaulted by a stranger in a gender-neutral space is astronomically small. And that's absolutely not to lessen the suffering of anyone who has experienced that. But it's certainly not something on which we should be basing sweeping changes to policy and mentality, especially not in a way that attacks the rights of a minority group who are far more likely to be the victim of SA than the perpetrator. But wait, the GCs are typing in the comments.
If we let people just decide what gender they are, then surely that number will go up.
Oh yeah? Show me your receipts. Because first, trans people have always been using gendered spaces. And secondly, while it's well known that anti-trans legislation increases the rates of SA against trans people, there is zero evidence that trans-inclusive policies and self-ID increase the overall rates of SA at all.
Media Matters, a liberal media watchdog, has asked state leaders, law enforcement, and school officials in places with these protections whether they've seen any increase in sexual assault or rape after passing these laws. And they have repeatedly said that they have not. "We have not seen that," a Des Moines Police Department spokesman told the outlet in 2014. "I doubt that's going to encourage the behavior. If the behavior's there, sexual predators are going to behave as they're going to behave, no matter what the laws are."
As usual, there is a sources and resources doc linked in the description where I've shared the links to all the articles and stats and stuff that I've used here, so check it out. Don't just take my word for it, have a look. Don't believe YouTubers. Things are getting heavy. I hate numbers. I usually try to avoid numbers. I also have dyscalculia, so if I did get anything wrong, you can't say anything or you're an ableist. It's not just the tiny risk of SA in changing rooms and toilets that the gender criticals are concerned with though. Gender criticals insist that there are loads of other really gross things that will happen in our toilets if we let people self-ID their gender. A fond pastime of GC Twitter does seem to be describing in detail the gross stuff that they have either seen or usually imagined going on in toilets. There's also a big trend of people sharing around clips from adult movies and then claiming that this is real life. For algorithmic purposes, I'm not gonna get into details too much with this, but let's just say it's like spreading around a panic that plumbers are out to steal your wife and then sharing Pornhub clips to prove it. And it's possible that the plumber does want your wife. How could you really know for sure? No, best just to ban plumbers just to be safe, or at least don't let women be alone with them. Gender criticals are extremely interested in people's genitals and bathroom habits though, and they spend their days, their long summer days, on the internet, sharing toilet thoughts. They seem convinced that men are just itching to get into the ladies' loos to trash the place. Everything from your traditional, good old-fashioned peeing on the toilet seat to new contenders like wiping their bits on the door handles. The things men get up to in toilets, according to middle-aged women on the internet, is sick. I spent many years working in hospitality, either in food and drink service or retail, and as such, I have spent way more time than I would have liked cleaning customer and staff toilets. And ladies, you girls are disgusting. Granted, men's toilets stink, but that's mainly because of urinals being badly designed or broken or old, those big trough ones that you get, nobody is getting in there to give them a proper scrub. Trust me. And sorry. But honestly, you're worried about piss on the seat. You don't even need to be the ones cleaning the toilets to know that women piss on the seat a bunch. Piss, shit, blood. I have had to wipe it all off seats in the women's toilets. And I know some of you out there will be doing detailed logistical modelling, trying to figure out how that happens. It's the squatters, the hoverers, the women who, for whatever reason, can't or simply will not sit on the seat. But if it's only on the seat, that's a good day. Blood on the doors, on the walls, on the toilet roll holder. Sanitary products just left astrewn. Puddles of piss on the ground from when the hovering went awry. And pipes clogged with tampons and pads and packaging, which I thought we all knew doesn't go down the toilet. Like, blood is a literal biohazard. If I were men, I'd be worried about us in the gender-neutral loos. Women's toilets are not these, like, lovely sanctums of ladiness where we're all just exposing our genitals to one another in safety and comfort. Personally, I find all open spaces in bathrooms and changing rooms uncomfortable. They are not spaces in which I tend to linger, and any interaction with any of them in there is undesirable and will be brief. So even in female-only spaces, I would still like lockable stalls with sinks inside. I do think that that's just the design which should be the standard going forward. It just makes more sense to me. Now, I did say I wasn't here to argue that everywhere needs to be gender neutral, but let's still look at some of the pros of this kind of bathroom design. Queue fairness. The problem of queues for women's toilets always being much longer than for the men's would be eliminated. Everyone is in one queue. And if you're out with people, you don't get that situation where all the men are done at the bathroom in 5 minutes and then are forced to wait for the women who are still queuing. You can queue together too. Have a nice little chat. I personally enjoy having a sink at hand in the stall. I think it's better for hygiene, as you don't have to touch the door before you can wash your hands. And just sometimes it happens that you need to clean up. I was out once with an elderly relative who didn't quite make it to the toilet on time. And there wasn't any private space in the toilet where we could get her cleaned up. They basically had to close the toilets for her, which was incredibly embarrassing, as I'm sure you can imagine. Yes, there was a disabled toilet on the other side of the cafeteria. Sinks in the stalls creates a more private space to get cleaned up if you need to. Also, I feel like having that one main door that everyone has to touch is just super unhygienic as well. Another problem that would be solved is the tendency to have the baby changing facilities either in the women's toilets or the disabled toilets, instead of there just being a spare room or two for that. When it used to be primarily in the women's toilets, this obviously presented the problem of men not being allowed to change their own babies. And when it's in the disabled toilet, it's not fair to make disabled people wait a pretty decent time. Like, depending on the state of the diaper and how cooperative the baby is feeling, changing a nappy properly probably takes longer than your average toilet trip. I don't know, maybe new baby changing technology has sped up the process since I've last done it. It has been a while. Shout out to my brothers, who are now in their 20s. But the point is that disabled people usually just have one toilet in the place that they can use, and so just not taking it up with other things I think is probably best. I worked in multiple places where the disabled toilet doubled up as a storage room, a staff toilet, a changing room, a break room sometimes. Oh God, I've worked in some places. Another problem it would solve is the old parental conundrum. So there are these threads on Mumsnet, both of fathers asking if they should be taking their daughters into the men's toilets, and also mothers asking at what point they should stop taking their sons into the women's toilets. And dear viewer, the response remains divided. Consensus was never reached. I mean, there was lots of different answers, different options you might have that may or may not be appropriate in different settings, with some people even suggesting to the dad, why not let a perfect stranger escort your daughter into the toilets without you? And not only is this a profoundly weird and entitled thing to ask a stranger, I would be taken aback. It's also super weird for the daughter though, right? Standing around while daddy asks random women if they can watch you pee. And then actually having to go through with it and like go to the toilet with a stranger. I could never. No. I'd hold it till I died. People were trying to pinpoint exactly at what age it becomes inappropriate for a boy to be in the women's toilets. 8 seemed a pretty popular guess. My thoughts are, you just can't say for every case at what age a child can go to the toilet unassisted. That's something each family and child should decide for themselves. There is also the issue of those who have carers of a different gender. People who, while they might still need some assistance, might not need all the accessibility functions of the disabled toilets. And then we can come back to trans, non-binary, or as I said, people who even slightly veer away from gender norms. Butch cis women and feminine cis men report having anxiety about using public bathrooms and changing spaces, who, much like trans people, create strategies to cope with this anxiety, such as limiting fluid intake while out, having a mental list of locations of safe toilets, and, obviously, holding it, which is a health risk. So is dehydrating yourself. That is a limit on freedoms, by the way. Like a real one.
A survey carried out with 28,000 transgender or diverse gender people with 18 years old or more in the United States in 2015 showed the following situations experienced up to 1 year before the research. 48% sometimes avoided and 11% always avoided using the bathroom, totaling 59%. 32% limited their drinking habits to avoid using the bathroom. 24% had their presence in a particular bathroom questioned or challenged. 12% were verbally harassed, physically attacked, or sexually abused when accessing or using a bathroom. 9% had access to the bathroom effectively denied.
Now, I did used to avoid using public bathrooms when I was a kid, but that was for autistic reasons. And apart from that, I can honestly say that I don't relate to any of that. I, as a cis white woman, absolutely cannot relate to something that is just matter-of-fact, daily life stuff for millions of people. Gender neutral, private, lockable spaces for toilet and changing just makes things more accessible, less complicated, and just nicer for everyone. And like, infrastructure needs updating every now and then, you know? Like, I'm not for at all tearing down old buildings unless there's like a good reason for it, but I am all for retrofitting. And I do personally think that most toilets and changing rooms could, nay should, be gender neutral in the way that I have described and for the reasons I've just outlined. Again, I'm not here to be cancelling all gendered spaces. I'm here for more infrastructure, more funding, better architecture and design. And I'm here for not excluding trans people from the spaces they need and the spaces which they have been using the whole time without causing problems for anyone. There is no evidence whatsoever that allowing trans people into the spaces according to their gender increases incidents of SA or misconduct at all. None. Transphobes might go,
Ooh, I found an example of a bad trans person though.
but that's neither here nor there. All the bad women in the world, all the cis female sexual predators going would never be enough for people to conclude that we shouldn't let kids near women. So if we're talking about actual evidence, statistically measurable evidence which lawmakers might use to write laws, there is zero evidence that SA is increased by trans inclusion. Trans people have no designs on toilets and changing rooms except going to the toilet and getting changed. Just like cis people don't. They're hardly social clubs. But while trans inclusion does nothing to harm others, trans exclusion is guaranteed to harm trans people. 45% of the people in that survey report having experienced some resistance to being able to use the bathroom, ranging from verbal challenges to being barred from entry to being physically assaulted, just in that year. Half of trans people have experienced SA, that's physical assault, not including harassment, with some reports estimating up to 66%. As well as this, while cis women have a 15% likelihood of being assaulted by a stranger, 47% of trans survivors were victims to strangers. So I am really unsure how anyone can claim that one trans woman in a bathroom full of women poses a risk, but forcing her into a room full of men doesn't. Gender-neutral bathrooms and changing rooms are, I think, amazing. They can be improved, but overall, good idea. Ultimately, they offer solutions to many of the problems that we see with these spaces when they're segregated, and it's stuff which would improve things for everyone. Most pushes towards inclusion for marginalised people would actually benefit everyone, like disability access, ramps on buildings for wheelchair users. Also helps elderly people. And guess who gets old? Most people. That's typically the way. But it's never framed like that. It's always painted as something that's coming for your freedom, rather than things that would make you freer. Funny that. Anyway.
Space 2. Prisons.
Prisons can't be talked about in the same way as toilets. That's why it's just so disingenuous when GCs just talk about women's spaces as if they're all just the same. Oh, anything that I say about prisons and what goes on in them is going to be highly contingent on what kind of prison I'm talking about and where it is. But as always, incarcerated LGBTQ people are much likely to experience SA and violence both at the hands of other inmates and staff. And when it comes to trans women in men's prisons, estimations are that they are up to 13 times more likely to experience SA again at the hands of other inmates or staff. As well as this, LGBTQ people are more likely to experience all forms of misconduct within prisons than the wider population. The extent of the violence and the harm done will, as I say, greatly depend on the kind of prison I'm talking about. So instead of just reeling off a list of depressing statistics, remember where the sources are, let's instead talk about different kinds of prison. I am ultimately a prison abolitionist, and if you've watched this channel for long enough, you've probably put that together. I think we should be transforming society for the better in all ways, and I think that a prison system and an incarcerated population is a societal failing. But I'm also a realist, and I know that just ban prisons isn't going to convince many people and probably sounds quite scary. So I'm also for reform and improvement and treating all incarcerated people with respect and dignity, and all the human rights that are supposedly universal. And that's not a moralistic position, but an evidence-based policy that not only reduces crime, but makes life better for incarcerated and previously incarcerated people and their families. As a prison abolitionist, I feel weird looking at different prison systems and being like, oh, look at that lovely prison. What a nice prison. What a lovely tool of oppression. So instead, I'll stick to talking about ideas, concepts of prison reform. From Southeast Asia to Northern Europe to South America, different concepts of minimal security, open prisons have been shown to just be better, like in every measurable way. Except, of course, for the owners and shareholders at massive corporations who increasingly depend on forced prison labour to line their pockets with even more profits. And of course, investors in the private security and prison industry, which is steadily accumulating land and power over hundreds and thousands of people and raking in billions in profits for the bother. Apart from them, people agree it's better. I'm talking about prisons where those who live inside them can come and go for work or family obligations, where there are functioning communities inside the prison limits, where families can live together, visitors can just rock up. Some prisons have schools for children. Incarcerated people can start businesses, make money, attend family events. And I'm not just talking about prisons who hold folk who did some insurance fraud or rich tax evaders, people like that. Some of these prisons hold people who have been convicted of violent crimes, including murder. I dislike talking about statistics about prisons and convicts here because crime and prison statistics are way too flattening for what is a hugely complex part of our society and history. And we all know how unethical readings of crime stats can be wielded against marginalised groups. And individual crimes, the context, the people involved, the details, these are not something which can be meaningfully talked about by way of statistics. And of course, the causes of crime conversation is one which must encompass a pretty detailed socioeconomic analysis in order to have any meaning, and so would be a full video. This is how the right win. They just say sound bites and then we have to spend weeks breaking it all down. What keeps me hopeful though is that eventually you begin to spot patterns in the sound bites. And I think once most people can do that, then we'll be on our way. Because we've got to have a bit of hope, don't we? Despite it all. Despite the climate crisis. And yeah, it's time to remember that this video is sponsored by Wren. Smooth and natural transition? Check. What with the climate being an official emergency, it's no wonder that many people are asking what they can do to help. While it's crucial to remember who is actually responsible for this catastrophe, that's the owners of capital and the neoliberal governments which have allowed them to run amok all over our one and only home, it's also understandable that people want to do their best as individuals. I know I do. I also recently went from trying to be vegetarian to trying to be vegan. Will my individual sacrifice make a difference? No. But will our collective sacrifices prevent climate change? Also no. But it does feel better to be doing something. So if you'd like to do something, then today's sponsor might be for you. Wren is known for being a carbon calculating website, and you can use their tool to quickly and easily estimate the amount of carbon you use. But the essence of Wren, and the reason I'm happy to let them sponsor my content, is the grassroots projects which they will fund with your money. These are locally led projects which are proven to be effective, and they would not exist without funding from Wren. You'll find a variety of projects to support, from new technologies aiming to reduce the existing buildup of carbon in our atmosphere, to reforestation projects, to legislative projects which are focused on governments and corporations. So offset your carbon footprint by supporting projects that actually matter through Wren. The first 100 people to sign up to Wren via the link in the description will have 10 extra trees planted in their name. Thank you to Wren. Now let's get back to the video. What was I saying? Oh yeah, the dangers of crime statistics and simple solutions to complex problems. Something that we can measure by way of statistics though is inmate well-being and rates of reoffending. And the statistics show that the more open and dignified a person's experience of prison is, the more likely they are to go on to have a decent life afterwards. Reforms, proper resources, excellent staff training and extremely high recruitment standards, independent and robust oversight, transparency, incarcerated people having some say, some autonomy over their conditions. These things make for safer prisons for everyone. Men abuse men in prisons, but in places where these reforms have taken place, the rate of abuse plummets. There's a fly in here. Oh no. The evidence is overwhelming, but these things can't happen with a privatized and authoritarian model. Again, abolitionist here, but like if I don't get my way, I'd at least like to see this. But would an open system like that work for everyone? I've talked about prison abolition and reforms enough times to know that the first thing people are thinking of is of the worst, most sadistic serial cases. And you don't get to just not address that as an anarchist. They won't let you. I swear half of the conversations that leftists have with non-leftists just ends up being various varieties of, but people bad?
People bad though.
Essentialism really has a lot to answer for. It's my opinion that anyone who is out of control, intent on hurting people, shouldn't be in a prison setting. There is something happening or has happened to them, and as such, they require focused and specialist attention. I obviously don't agree that any human being should be treated inhumanely. Capital punishment, to me, is an abomination. Punishment doesn't work in the best of times, let alone in serial cases. But we don't get individualized and specialist attention without funding, without the political will, without an understanding of what a humane justice system looks like. And like with all of these things, gender-critical activists don't really have much to say when it comes to improving society overall. Their whole thing is excluding trans people. They aren't talking about the general well-being of incarcerated women, or looking at ways to reduce the number of incarcerated women or helping them upon release. They don't support the kinds of politics that incarcerated people need. In fact, they mostly hinder them. They are a branch of the conservative right wing. And even if individual people within the GC movement claim to be leftists, their movement is largely funded by the conservative right for a reason. See my other video to find out the reasons. And so, through them and their ideals, we will never see a society which cares for all people equally.
Space 3. Hospital wards and residential facilities.
When it comes to healthcare and residential facilities, GCs don't just have their sights set on residents and patients, but on the staff too. There have been a few cases of gender criticals refusing the care of trans medical workers, as well as multiple accounts of harassment and assault against trans medical professionals. To me, it is frankly maddening to see anybody put off a career in one of the most valuable and important sectors in society, a sector which is chronically understaffed. And I find it utterly bizarre that someone would rather continue in pain than to drop the bigotry for a sec and accept care from a trained professional. And that's all that is, really, isn't it? Straight up bigotry. Like when racists refuse to be seen by medical professionals of colour. So this is obviously where the fake trans argument appears, which we have already addressed. And in fact, any argument that rests on safeguarding from predatory individuals can really be addressed by simply calling for more oversight, more funding, more transparency, more accountability, and a socialised model of infrastructure. Anytime GCs bring up safeguarding, Ask them what, apart from excluding trans people, are they doing to promote safety and well-being in society? Because of course the safety and well-being of vulnerable people should be a priority for any society. It's a pretty big problem, for example, that people housed in residential facilities are abused by the staff. This is true of men, women, disabled and elderly people. This is a problem that more oversight, more funding, more transparency, collective ownership, improved recruitment and background checks and training would go a long way to solve. These are places where people are at their most vulnerable. All steps should be taken to ensure that professionals in these spaces are up to the task and not predatory. And before the GCs start, we can't be taking biological essentialist views on who may or may not be predatory. For example, there is a long history of female nurses abusing those people in their care, even murdering them. And it has long been a part of feminist struggles to undermine the assumption that women are just naturally better suited to care roles. That whole thing of men are doctors, women are nurses, that was only just starting to change in the mainstream when I was a kid. Women being naturally better suited to caring roles is a myth. And it's a myth which has kept men who would make excellent caring professionals out of the industry, as well as glossing over abuse done by women. But I do actually think that people should be able to refuse care if they are not comfortable with those giving it. But obviously, with an underfunded and largely privatized care and social care system, there's often not that much choice. And this is a problem. There should only be excellent care services available to choose from. And if an individual has an interpersonal issue with any care worker or medical professional, they should have the opportunity to be seen by someone else. You know, the problems that GCs say they fear, like vulnerable people being at risk from predators or the undermining of women's rights, that's now. That's happening now. That's the current state of things. People are oppressed, and cycles of violence remain unbroken due to lack of socio-economic opportunities and support. Misogyny abounds. We don't have to be doing mental gymnastics to try and invent this new form of misogyny, which is when the leaflet in the GP's office about periods says the word people in it. Or when you can't quite be sure what someone looks like between the legs. Misogyny, real misogyny, like the kind that removes women of their fundamental human rights and autonomy over their own body, that's still there, largely pushed by the people funding the GC movement. And the solutions to the problem of misogyny, of abuse, of SA, of violence in general is, and I cannot believe that in 2022 I need to say this, not transphobia, but the solutions are antithetical to everything this gender-critical, sex-realist movement stands for. And I know I keep repeating that, but it's really important. So I've talked about staff and medical professionals, but you would be shocked to hear that GCs have thoughts about patients too. Men in the women's wards, etc., and so forth. So the GC argument about this seems to come from two directions. One, of course, is the fake trans argument, and the other one I would assume has to be privacy. Because it's not as if women's wards are entirely female-only spaces anyway. Visitors are allowed, people come and go, like hospital wards are pretty much open to the public, or at least to other patients within the hospital. So I presume that privacy must be the concern here. And I do see privacy being an issue in a completely mixed gender ward, because it's just curtains, isn't it, most of the time. But again, we just come back to my favourite response, the infrastructure response. Make nicer wards. We haven't changed ward design much since the Victorian times. Have booths instead where only one side is a curtain, that kind of thing. And of course, where appropriate, a private room is obviously optimal. But again, we come back to the need for more investment and for a socialised model. We need better, bigger and more hospitals everywhere. But remember, and it's really important that you do remember this, the issue at hand isn't mixed gender wards. It's gender criticals and their ongoing mission to make trans people feel as uncomfortable as possible and as unsafe as possible, either pursuing a career in medicine or accessing the healthcare they need.
Space 4. Abuse Crisis Services.
So originally I was going to do a video just about this, but then I realised that a lot of the arguments I was going to make apply to many spaces. And honestly, I just wanted to show why GCs are just wrong about everywhere, to be honest. But it's when they talk about IPV and SA provisions that I get properly riled up. As many of you will be aware, I was in several abusive relationships which were abusive in a number of ways. And that's all I'm going to say about that, or this video will never see the algorithmic light of day. But I will say that lack of provisions, lack of support, lack of advice, this was a large part, not the only part, but a large part of why I stayed in those relationships as long as I did. Shelters and resources for IPV and SA survivors are constantly at their limits. Underfunded, under-resourced, having to rely on charity rather than secure state funding. And things only get worse when we look at resources for men. In many places, advice and support for male victims of SA and IPV are non-existent. Toxic masculinity not only teaches men and boys that IPV and SA isn't something that happens to them, but the resulting psychological trauma from the lack of support then makes them more likely to abuse others around them. And it is undeniable that this cycle of male abuse and violence inevitably has an effect on IPV and SA against women and girls. Even if you are adamant that men and women are completely different and sex is a binary, which it isn't, but even if, you don't get to pretend that men and women exist in different worlds and that what happens to one group doesn't ultimately affect the other. And that cycle only breaks when men and boys get the emotional help and material support that they need to escape abusive patterns and relationships, and to then have the understanding and resources to live full and healthy lives afterwards. I found that GCs hate talking about men in even slightly sympathetic terms. One commenter on my last video actually stated outright that we absolutely should not try to understand why men might be statistically more violent. The answer is simple. They like it. They simply love to abuse. Case closed. Another thing they don't like to talk about is that men are actually more likely than women to be the victim of violent crime, excluding SA and R. In the USA, 1 in 3 women will experience IPV, but so will 1 in 4 men. In the UK, it's 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men. And an estimated 10 to 20% of children live in homes with IPV, and obviously around half of whom will be boys. And statistics for male victims of SA and R are notoriously underestimated. Men and boys are much less likely to report that kind of crime, and so the true numbers are hard to know. There's a reason I'm talking about men right now, and that reason is that another favourite GC pastime, besides sharing toilet thoughts, is to seek out and harass organisations and services which provide SA, IPV and R supports to people. I'm not joking. They have piled on and caused problems for multiple helplines that offer support for people who have been abused.
Because it doesn't say women, because only women get abused.
Sorry, does my head in. They've sued LGBTQ charities, and they've brought their politics into the industry with multiple reports of transphobia from practitioners. There's also multiple stories of whistleblowers, people working inside the industry, and it seems like gender-critical activists are turning workplaces which are supposed to be focused on helping people into ideological battlegrounds.
One incident occurred when Lily's workplace was developing a helpline for clients. They asked for clarity on who the helpline was for. The reply from the Director of Operations and another senior staff member was that, quote, "If they sounded like a woman on the phone, talk to them. But if they don't sound like a woman, it doesn't matter that they say they are. Hang up. We're not supporting them." End quote. Lily also heard assertions that only biological women should have access to refuges, and accusations from senior staff members that junior employees were behaving like perpetrators by supporting trans inclusivity, as it put them on the side of men.
However, in the UK and the USA, representatives of organisations tasked with the protection of women and girls, help for unhoused people, and those who run crisis lines have repeatedly stated that trans inclusion does not pose any problems, and that the morally panicked claims of gender-critical activists are completely unevidenced. That's absolutely not to say that there is no debate happening within the industries we're talking about. Lily's story shows that there are. There are obviously just transphobes who want to deny help for trans people, just as there are fundamentalist Christians who deny birth control to women based on their beliefs. But then there are honest conversations about how to best distribute a very limited resource to those who most need it. My opinion is that anyone who withholds support from someone based on their perceived gender or race or sexuality or anything of the sort is doing harm. Even if they themselves are not equipped to help that person, I feel like just hanging up, pulling down the shutters, turning them away without at least offering any direction towards where they might find help, without assisting them in any way, then that's not really a matter of limited resources. That's just outright gatekeeping. And any honest conversation about how to best distribute a limited resource, if this conversation doesn't also include ways to make that resource less limited, if it isn't also a conversation about how to include more people, it's at best going to be a limited and unhelpful debate in the long run, and at worst, just even more gatekeeping. But, and this seems to be something which is increasing recently, it seems to me that organisations which are tasked with really important work are having to spend their time and energy issuing statements and press releases denouncing this supposedly feminist movement. Recently, a gender-critical activist took photos of people queuing outside a building, stating that this is the local women's shelter and is proof that men are taking advantage of them. It turns out that the shelter in question is not only open and inclusive of trans and non-binary people, but that it also offers a community food bank to all people who need it. Another commenter posted that it's actually much more likely that that queue was for an ATM. But the shelter in question looks amazing and wonderful, and yet this GC person and many others have taken it upon themselves to label it unsafe. I've linked to the shelter's website below if you want to go and support them, by the way. This person was really pushing this, by the way, like they were deleting their posts and reposting it as soon as the truth overwhelmed the comments, like obsessed. And I saw their post shared elsewhere on the internet in other gender critical groups, with people commenting saying they've contacted the shelter with their thoughts, or that they're gonna write to a local politician to look into it. It's not true that the people in that photograph are queuing for a woman's shelter. The shelter has issued a statement, because of course they've had to. And anyway, queues outside the women's shelter isn't really a thing that happens. IPV shelters typically don't have queues running down the streets. And even if they did, if you're so concerned with the safety of victims, then why would you continuously post photos of where they are on the internet? Real feminism is when you dox IPV victims. And that brings me to another thing. Screening. As I've previously said, shelters and resources are chronically underfunded, understaffed, and under-resourced. Therefore, they are not in the position to help everyone who needs it. Therefore, they're not just going to let anyone walk in off the street and house them with absolutely no screening. Not only do they need to make sure that they're only helping those who need it, they also need to make sure that they're not letting their residents' abusers into the space. It does happen that abusers will try to track down their victims. And so staff working at shelters and on hotlines are specially trained to be able to spot someone who's trying to get access for this reason.
Women seeking safety in a refuge are assessed to determine what risk they pose to the other women and children living there. First, each woman is asked about the abuse she's experienced, going over all the details of what happened and when. Does the woman have a criminal record? If she does, what is it for? A refuge might take a woman who's been arrested for stealing food, but not if she's been convicted of a violent crime. Does she use drugs or alcohol? Does she have children? How many? How dangerous is her abuser? Does he have access to weapons? After the screening process, the woman may be invited to the refuge, but she won't be given an address. She'll be given a description of a person who will take her to the refuge and a place to meet them. All of this security is designed to ensure a dangerous abuser can't gain access to a women's refuge. Pink News asked Diana whether, as anti-trans campaigners claim, a cisgender man pretending to be a transgender woman could get through the screening process in order to gain access to vulnerable women living in refuges. I would say that it was impossible for a cis man to get through the screening process, she said bluntly.
These services are stretched beyond belief and are constantly trying their best to help as many people as possible. So any taking up their time with ideological games, endangering their service users by posting photos of them online, constantly forcing them to issue statements and press releases, berating their staff and basically doxing them for abuse. This is not good feminism. I can't believe I need to say that. Can't believe I need to say so much of the things I've had to say in this video. Shelters absolutely do need to be safe spaces for service users and workers. And as I have said about residential facilities and hospitals, service users should have a choice about what care is appropriate for them. And when it comes to trauma, there is never going to be one answer that suits all needs. For example, my opinion, based on my personal experience, is that any help at all would have been a godsend. I would not have needed female-only spaces. Any help whatsoever would have done. But just because that's true for me, doesn't mean that's true for everyone.
But gender-critical activists casting aspersions on the kinds of services I so desperately needed, it pisses me off, to put it lightly. You do not get into these caring environments unless you can show that you need it. You do not get any help in this society unless you can prove that you need it. Any trans person in a shelter needs it by definition. And given that trans people are at a higher risk of abuse and assault, they are more likely to need it. I find it appalling to hear stories like, if they sound male, just hang up, and we don't do transgenders. How absolutely heartless can you be? Where is your empathy? How can you look at objectively marginalised, oppressed, and powerless people and see predators? It's giving me Breaking Point poster vibes. And I wonder why that might be. We need more and more and more and more spaces and services for everyone who needs them. We do not need to be wasting the time and resources of the services that are already there. There does need to be female-only spaces, especially, I think, in the cases of SA and R crisis centres and support groups. But as per the law and all reasonable views of gender, trans women are women and so deserve to be supported as women. And they do not get into these spaces unless they need them, unless they are a victim, and therefore share the experience of SA, IPV, or R. Men also need their own spaces to heal from abuse and the ways that men specifically are made to feel about being abused. LGBTQ people will need spaces that understand their specific struggles. Just as all marginalised people need to feel as if there are places where they belong and will be understood. When I argue for more resources, I'm also arguing for more kinds of resources and less gatekeeping of the ones that are already there. Gatekeeping which kinds of victims really deserve help doesn't do anything to stop abuse or help survivors. Individual people are not, nor have they ever been, things that can fit nicely into predefined little boxes. I said before that there is no one right approach when it comes to trauma, but that's just true of people. There needs to be as many approaches towards care as there are people who need care. Good practitioners know that the most important step towards really helping someone is to listen to them. Their care needs will not be something that you can find in a textbook. It will depend on them, their history, their situation, their strengths and limitations. Variety, quality, and inclusivity should be the rallying cry for all those who claim to care about safe spaces and care services, instead of trying to define down to a point exactly which kind of person deserves the limited care available. But one thing is for sure, turning the presence of a victim in a crisis centre for victims as a sign of the undermining of victim safety disgusts me. It physically disgusts me. It's absolutely no different in my mind to anti-refugee sentiment on the grounds of national security. Somebody who has made up their mind to escape abuse and who is actively seeking shelter, they're doing one of the hardest things they have probably ever had to do in their whole life. It will be the worst moment in their whole life. Caught between a life that they know will probably kill them and the terrifying void of life beyond. I can't imagine how it must feel to have mustered
all the courage that you could possibly muster to be at the door of help, to only be told, sorry, we don't care about people like you. That is life or death. Me being a woman, receiving help, but that help being in proximity to a trans woman or a man is not. Again, I do think that nobody should be forced into accepting care in a way that makes them uncomfortable. I just think the answer is more staff, more resources, more spaces, more infrastructure, more choice. But we can't treat just outright bigotry with the same empathy that we would treat someone who is genuinely uncomfortable for valid reasons. To do so undermines those who are being genuinely mistreated and upholds bigotry. There is a difference between comfort and safety. Gender-critical discussions about these types of spaces typically revolve around the feelings of white, cis, gender-critical women. They want you to think that feeling safe and being safe is synonymous. Think of all those videos of racist women in the USA. In fact, Kaylin Conrad brought up this point in their series, Inside a Cult. The Central Park birdwatching incident, aka Central Park Karen, was an incident in which a black man, Christian, was birdwatching in an area of Central Park which had been designated as a nature reserve, and in which dogs were supposed to be leashed. Amy was walking her dog unleashed, and a discussion ensued between her and Christian about this. Christian then tried to beckon her dog over and away from the birds with treats, at which point Amy called the police. Amy felt unsafe, and so Amy said to Christian, "I'm gonna tell them there's an African American man threatening my life." Who was actually in danger in this incident? Amy knew what her words meant. As an American, she knew the threat of death that she was hanging over Christian's head. Christian was nowhere near her, and there was witnesses watching the pair. The only person who was unsafe in that situation was Christian. But it was Amy who felt unsafe. Central Park's bird population were also pretty unsafe with Amy and her dog on the loose. Poor dog too. That's why I'm not really playing the full video, because that bit with the dog is just too upsetting. But what if Amy had a gun, as Americans are wont to do? If you are a racist, even if you've just been conditioned by racism, you might very well feel unsafe in areas where there are a lot of people of colour. That Dang Dad made an excellent video about how cops are conditioned to feel unsafe 24/7 and therefore always ready to spring into action. But if an armed racist man feels unsafe around a group of young black lads, who's actually in danger there? In fact, the more unsafe the racist feels, the more actually unsafe will be the people around him. And that's what the GCs are doing. Apart from also standing up for Central Park Karen, see Kaylin's video for receipts. It can't be that the discomfort of a minority of people is then used to restrict vital care for millions of people who desperately need it. But it is. That is exactly what is happening every single time this debate takes centre stage. Conclusion. So those are my thoughts on the kinds of spaces that gender-critical people seem concerned with. Remember, these are my thoughts on spaces that I have used and will use, hopefully excluding prison. I am speaking about my perspective about how I feel about what gender criticals have to say about them. I've spoken about the pros of gender neutral spaces, and I do think that in many cases we should be moving towards that model. But I have also acknowledged that in some cases, gendered spaces are appropriate. And while the conversation in the media typically tends to be gender neutral, yay or nay, and so I've used those words, it might be more helpful to talk less of gender neutrality and more about gender inclusivity. I am a feminist, and I am not one of those people who thinks that socially constructed is synonymous with non-existent. I can't be a feminist if I think gender relations aren't real. When gender criticals talk about women being erased, it cuts through if people think that gender neutrality is synonymous with gender doesn't matter.
The concept of gender inclusivity may be of value here. Whereas gender neutrality is essentially incompatible with a gendered analysis, provided that gender neutrality is equated with the assumption that gender is irrelevant, inclusivity offers a more nuanced intervention. Rather than precast individuals and communities in gender-specific trajectories, an inclusive approach would allow scholars and activists to retain emphases on patriarchy and violence against women, while simultaneously acknowledging that people of any gender might enact the status of aggressor/perpetrator or victim/survivor.
And after all, the answer to gender-critical arguments about these spaces is not to just push for different kinds of spaces. To do so ignores the real harm at the centre of their ideology. The issue at hand is trans people's right to use the spaces they need in safety, and the right for all people to get to decide for ourselves how we exist in this world. Trans women are women, and trans men are men. And that is not a statement of ideology, but of reality. Any biological difference between me and a trans person is just that, a biological difference, which has no bearing on anyone or anything beyond the realm of medicine. Unless, of course, you're a biological essentialist, which you should not be, because it's silly nonsense. And it's bad if a trans person is in a space intended to help vulnerable people. It's because they are a vulnerable person in need of help. If they are in the toilet, it's because they need the toilet. Within all instances of abuse, there is a power imbalance. And wealthy gender-critical people are using all the power they can gather to target one of the most powerless groups in society. And all the while, they claim that it's the gender ideologues and the trans rights activists who hold all the power, who have infiltrated education, the NHS, law itself. Just like all fascistic hate movements, their enemy is both too powerful and too weak, both brainwashed and brainwasher. Only they speak the truth, the common sense truth. Only they really care about women and girls. And they will use legislation, campaigning, media, and bureaucracy to police what other people get to do with their own bodies. That's their whole thing. They know best what healthcare other people need, what spaces other people get to use, where you can go and when. They want you to be documented and properly assigned by the state, all based on biological essentialism, which has its roots in fundamentalist Christianity and conservative and authoritarian politics. Whereas the scary trans rights activists just want to piss in safety. They want to get help when they need it and to be recognised as who they are and to just enjoy the same rights as everyone else. That's it. Making these videos got me thinking about the female experience and like in what ways and how I relate to other women. As a neurodivergent person, I've always lived in a world where just me being me was never enough, where I was pressured both subliminally and loudly to do better, be different, pretend harder, act better. I was dismissed and seen as weird. I was bullied, mainly by cis women and girls, and I was abused, mainly by cis men. I've been attacked and abused, had my life threatened. Sometimes just because I'm a woman, but mostly because I'm seen as an especially easy target. I feel safer, more accepted, and more comfortable in gender and neurodiverse spaces. I'll feel more secure and I will relate to them way more than I would with a room full of cis, straight, white women. And when we throw politics, religion, and class into the mix, like a room full of fundamentalist right-wing Christian women, to me, does not a safe space make. As a female working in hospitality for many years, I've obviously been harassed, groped, propositioned in any number of ways. But so have every single one of my male colleagues. Drunken female customers, even female managers, have leered at, grabbed at, and sexually harassed my male colleagues. All instances of abuse involve a power imbalance, and individual experience does not and never will align with gender essentialist ideals. A biological essentialist viewpoint will never be about safeguarding. Conservative politics will never bring about the kinds of services and spaces we all need. And an ideology based in the policing of people's expression and their fundamental freedom will never, ever be anything more than just another way to keep people oppressed. Oh, we did it. Oh, yes, we did it. It's all done. We did it. Yeah. Oh no, I've got more to film later. Okay, so first and foremost, thank you to my patrons. I really couldn't do this without you. Every single one of my videos is because of you. Thank you to everybody who lent their voices for this video. You made it come alive. Their links are all listed in the description. You have to go and follow them right now. And also extra special super duper thanks to all of my script readers. Thank you so much for your time and your feedback. It was so valuable. I learned so much and it made this script just 10 times better. The names going by on your screen right now are of the coolest people on the earth currently. So, you know, I assume you want in on that. I mean, like, if you want to be cool, which I guess you do, then join the club. There's a link. You can click on that and it'll take you right there to the club where you can support this channel and get perks. And there's things I offer. I don't know. Have a look yourself. All right, bye.